Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, Equal Employment Opportunity and Human Resource Management. We're going to talk about laws and legality and what it is okay and not okay to do when we're looking at making personnel decisions. We're also going to get a chance to look at some really interesting cases, and we're going to talk about times when maybe we're not quite sure what the right answer is as far as legality goes. So there's some pretty interesting scenarios that we're going to talk about in today's lecture. So equal employment opportunity as a premise is the treatment of all individuals in all aspects of employment, hiring, promotion, training in a fair and non-biased manner. What can we not do? What is discriminatory? It is illegal to discriminate in any aspect of employment. So that includes hiring and firing, compensation, assignment or classification of employees, transfer, promotion, layoff, or recall, job advertisements, recruitment, testing, use of company facilities, training and apprenticeship programs, fringe benefits, pay retirement plans and disability leave, or other terms and conditions of employment. It's also illegal to harass people based on their color, race, religion, sex, national origin, disability, genetic information, or age. You can't retaliate against somebody if they file a charge of discrimination. You cannot make employment decisions based on stereotypes or assumptions about the abilities of people from protected groups. And you can't deny employment opportunities to a person because they are married to or associated with somebody who is part of a protected group. When I use the term protected group, what do I mean? So protected classes are individuals of a minority race, women, older people, and those with disabilities who are covered by federal laws on equal employment opportunity. More specifically, if we're talking about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we're talking about classes which include race, color, religion, national origin, sex, age, and those with physical or mental abilities. And age and physical and mental abilities are defined under different laws. So there are quite a few laws that affect equal employment opportunity. We will discuss most of these in the lecture. However, as far as a test goes, the only act that I will outright want you to know the name of is the Title VII of Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the second one down, because that is actually the one that talks about protected classes who are protected based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a federal law, so it applies to all the states, and it sets minimum protections. So who is covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964? All private employers in interstate commerce who employ 15 or more employees for 20 or more weeks per year. That does mean that if you have less than 15 employees, you are not held liable to the Civil Rights of 1964. So, if I walked into a mom and pop shop that employed 5 people and I said I would like a job and they said, we are not interested because you're female, I could not actually sue them under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They do not employ enough people to be held accountable to that. That does not mean that there are not state and local laws that would provide protection to me. It's just I would not be covered under the federal law, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. State and local governments are held to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Private and public employment agencies, including U.S. Employment Services. Joint labor management committees that govern apprenticeship or training programs. Labor unions having 15 or more members or employees. So again, 15 being the magic number there. Public and private educational institutions, and foreign subsidiaries of U.S. organizations employing U.S. citizens. So that's kind of interesting. If you go to and you want to apply to an organization that is based in the U.S., but you want to work in their location that's based in Germany, you are actually still held to U.S. laws, not to German laws in that case. So even though you are not supposed to discriminate, for the majority of the time, that does not mean you can't legally discriminate. There is a test question on that. You are able to legally discriminate. However, in order to do that, you have to prove that this is a case where bona fide occupational qualifications take place, or BFOQs. So there are two reasons in which you might be able to legally discriminate because it's a BFOQ. So the first thing that we'll talk about is safety. If I, as an employer, can prove that I have to hire a particular sex or age because of safety issues, then I am exempt from, anti-discrimination kind of rulings. So what does that look like? Well, there was a case where a woman wanted to be a prison guard, specifically in a wing of the prison that dealt with male violent sexual criminals. So the prison warden said no, because he was concerned that not only would she be putting herself into danger, but that it could rile up the particular prisoners that were in that wing, which could cause rioting, which could also put other guards in some sort of safety peril. So she sued, based on discrimination, that she wasn't given a job because she was a woman, which was correct. And the court said, well, this is a BFOQ to work in this particular wing of the prison. Not that you can't be a prison guard if you're a woman, but to work in that particular wing that had to deal with male violent sexual criminals, you had to be a man for safety reasons. So that was a case where that organization was able to legally discriminate based on a protected class, but because it was a bona fide occupational qualification, a BFOQ that has to do with safety. Another example is there was a case where they had two jet fighter pilots who were Jewish, and they wanted to wear the traditional religious garb yarmulke on their head. And the Air Force said, no, you can't, because it's a safety issue. We're worried if you're doing evasive maneuvering, it could slip, it could get in on your controls, you might not be able to see. So for safety purposes, we are not going to allow you the religious freedom to wear your traditional religious garb. So they sued, it went to court, and the court found in favor of, they found against the two plaintiffs, and said, no, this really is a safety issue. So safety trumps a lot of things in the workplace. And it is, if you can prove it's a legit safety concern, a lot of times that will trump, these sort of discriminatory allegations. The second thing that you can claim as a BFOQ that would allow you to legally discriminate is something called business necessity. So that is where it is a core function of the job for you to be a particular sex, to be a particular religion, to be a particular national origin in order to do the job. So an example of this would be, let's say I was I wanted to hire a Catholic priest. It would be okay for me to say, you must be Catholic to have this job. So, people who are Jewish, people who are Muslim, people who are of other faiths need not apply. So I really am discriminating people based on their religious belief, but in this case, it's a business necessity. You have to be Catholic to be a Catholic priest to hold this position. Business necessity is decided on a case-by-case basis, and you have to be careful that you really are articulating a salient and appropriate business need in order to discriminate. You can't just be like, well, hot women should work here, and therefore I think only X, race is hot, therefore I'm only hiring this class because this is what's going to bring in business. That's not an appropriate reason. It's not a legal reason, and courts would not find in favor of that. So now we're going to do the activity for this chapter. So you are going to have to, you're just going to have to trust me here, and this is very relevant to the chapter. But what I want you to do is I want you to be put in a position where you are hiring new servers for the restaurant Hooters. So I want you in your activity, again, about a page and a half, I want you to write me an ad. What are you going to include in your ad? I want you to talk about what qualities you're looking for in a server. So what specific wording are you going to use? And then as a sort of a separate thought, I really want you to think about Hooters as an organization and say, what kind of environment are you trying to foster? What does this business exist to do? This is actually a pretty salient and interesting legal question. So suspend disbelief, do the activity. I would love it if you would pause the lecture now and do the activity now, because I'll discuss it here in a second. So that would be my preferred, way that we go about this. So hopefully you did the activity. I actually have you guys do this as an activity because this was actually a lawsuit. So multiple lawsuits have been filed against Hooters for not hiring male servers. And although there has never been a court ruling on this, so we have no precedence to say whether or not, what a court would find on this, we do know what the Hooters defense was. So Hooters used the BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification, as a defense, and they said that Hooters girls are there to provide a vicarious sexual entertainment. So much like if you were hiring strippers at a male-oriented clientele strip club, and you were hiring only female dancers to serve that need, you would say it would be a bona fide occupational qualification. That's essentially the same kind of argument that they were making, right? However, people who didn't think that maybe this was a great argument said that servers' primary job is to serve food and drink, which is neither a male or female thing, right? You could do this both ways. Also, critics brought up the fact that Hooters brands itself as a family-friendly restaurant, and in fact has a children eat free day in many locations. So they made the argument, well, how can you be this sort of vicarious sexual entertainment, aka kind of a strip club or adult-oriented place of business, and still be family-friendly, still have kid eats free? How do you meld those two things together? So again, no precedence, no court ruled on this. They settled out of court. However, we do have a court case that kind of had something similar. So Wilson versus Southwest Airlines was kind of the same kind of argument. So back in the day, Southwest Airlines hired very pretty flight attendants, and they wore kind of pretty skimpy outfits, sort of short shorts, short skirts, white boots, showed a lot of skin, and they got a court case against them, saying basically you're only hiring female, young, attractive, sexy stewardesses. And so when they went to court, basically what Southwest Airlines said is this is a BFOQ because this is what our clientele expect, right? Our businessmen, expect to fly on our airlines, and they expect to have, nice eye candy, and this is what sets our business apart. This is our business model. And the court actually found against them. They said, no, your primary business is to get people from point A to point B. You are a transportation, airlines. Your primary business focus is not sort of providing, attractive eye candy, even if you think that this is providing you like an edge over your competitors. Your core business is moving people from point A to point B. If we go back and look at Hooters, the question is what do they exist to do? Are they a restaurant? Are they there for beer and wings? Is that why people go? Are they a sports bar? Or do people go to look at the girlies, right? It's a legal question because if they exist really for people to go look at the girlies, then I think it is a BFOQ that you have to be a girl to work there, right? If it really is a sports bar, beer and wings, then you don't really gain that BFOQ advantage, right? That doesn't really apply to you. Anybody can be a server. So moving on to age discrimination, you cannot actually discriminate against people because of their age. However, there is a cutoff for that. And the cutoff magical number, I usually ask people in class what they think that number is. Usually I hear like 60, 65. The answer is 40. So I can actually say, I'm not hiring you because you're not old enough. I can say that I'm not hiring you because I don't want somebody in their 30s, but the magic number is the minute you turn 40 and I say I'm not hiring you because of your age, you become a protected class. So what can't I do under age discrimination actions? I can't exclude older workers from important work activities, and again, 40 is the magic number. I can't make negative changes in their performance evaluations of older employees just because they're older. I can't deny older employees job-related education, career development, or promotional opportunities. So I can't say, well, they're going to retire soon anyway, so why would I develop them? You can't do that. That's illegal. I can't select younger job applicants over older, better qualified candidates. So I can't say, well, somebody who's 20 is going to take half the salary of somebody who's 45. I can't use that as a reasoning to hire a younger employee over an older, better qualified candidate. I can't pressure older employees into taking early retirement. I can't reduce job duties and responsibilities of older employees. And I can't terminate older employees through downsizing. Now, I do have a clip here. I'd like you to watch it. And really, it kind of provides the devil advocate position. So a lot of times when I'm teaching this lecture, I get a lot of people who ask, why does the government get to tell me what I can and cannot do in the workplace? So here we have somebody who challenges the legitimacy of this, particular piece of legislation. I think we can kind of continue to be critical thinkers and think whether or not these laws are still applicable. For the purposes of this class, though, I really need you to know what is okay and what is not okay to do in the workplace as far as what current legal rules say. But I'm not against people, taking a critical approach to it. That's a little bit outside the context of the class. But I did want to give you at least that one kind of viewpoint of, are all of these laws good laws? So we are not allowed to discriminate based on religious preference unless it is a BFOQ. So what we basically say we cannot do is we can't discriminate based on religion and employment decisions. We define religion to include all aspects of religious observance as practice. We do not require employers to grant complete religious freedom, but we do require that employees make reasonable accommodations. And you're going to hear this again when we talk about disabilities. So reasonable accommodations means that you should make a reasonable effort to provide accommodations. It doesn't mean you should bankrupt your organization or bend over backwards to provide every single kind of accommodation, but you should be a reasonable person on how you go about that. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. Before we get there, I thought we would look up some of the particularly interesting religious discrimination cases that have happened recently. So we go to the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's website. So if we look at the fiscal year of 2014, we see that the EEOC received a little over 3,500 charges alleging discrimination on the basis of religion. The EEOC has filed 68 lawsuits since the beginning of fiscal year 2010 involving claims of religious discrimination. They found that they recovered approximately $4 million, so not small chunks of change as far as these lawsuits have gone. And then they talk about 3 that were kind of notable cases. So EEOC versus Abercrombie & Fitch. So there were 2 lawsuits against Abercrombie & Fitch, particularly talking about Muslim teams who wanted to wear hijabs, which are religious headscarves. If we look at AutoZone, we see that there's a discrimination lawsuit filed in September 2010. So they harassed a Sikh employee and refused to accommodate his religious needs to wear a turban. We also find that EEOC filed a claim against essentially Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they found that they would not allow a person to wear pants because of their dress code policy, but the person who filed the claim actually couldn't wear pants because of her religious beliefs. So they just terminated her instead of sort of making some sort of reasonable accommodation. So these are not things that don't occur. They do occur. We've seen that there's quite a few religious discrimination claims filed. And There's been a couple people that repeatedly have gotten in trouble. Abercrombie and Fitch is one of those people, which is why I have the sort of famous Abercrombie and Fitch 24-pack guy picture on the thing. Particularly, they've been in trouble in the past because it's a fine line between what is a BFOQ and what's not a BFOQ, right? So if you are a model, then you could be expected to look a certain way. But Abercrombie and Fitch was having the problem where they were consistently hiring sales associates that they wanted to look like their models, that they wanted to look like their brands. And their brand is pretty Midwest, white, blonde, blue-eyed, corn-fed kind of a look to them. So that's who they were hiring as their sales associates. But a sales associate is not a model. You don't have to be a model to do that job. So they were filed against on racial discrimination as well as religious discrimination. So they faced it on a couple different ends. So what does reasonable accommodation look like as far as religious preference goes? So these are things like holidays and observances. If I have a faith that requires that I have a day off for religious observance, then as long as that's not going to bankrupt the company, it's not going to grind everything to halt, you should give me that day off. Personal appearances, beards, veils, or turbans. The only thing that can override that are things like safety. So if you're working around things that, pieces of machinery where things can get caught, that can sometimes override that religious personal expression. Religious conduct on the job is part of reasonable accommodation. It's a good segue into the Americans with Disability Act, ADA, because they also talk about reasonable accommodation. But first we'll talk about what Americans with Disability Act is. So a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of major life events. You have to have a record of such impairment, and you have to be regarded as having such an impairment. Kind of vague language. It gets a little bit more specific. We're talking kind of generalities right now. So the Americans with Disability Act of 1990 requires that employees make a reasonable accommodations for disabled people. The only thing that can trump that is they take into account your ability to pay. So there was an example of a small mom and pop printing company. I think they were based out of Seattle. They had 5 employees, and they hired somebody, and that person had never worked in kind of a printing press kind of area before, and found out that he or she was, and I don't remember if it was male or female. We'll say it was a male. He found out that he was very toxically allergic to small amounts of ink in the air. So the organization investigated what it would take to accommodate him. So basically excessive ways to draw all of the particles out of the air. And they found out to have a system that filtered the air to that kind of level of specificity would cost millions of dollars. And this was a small mom and pop company that didn't even gross that much. So the employee took him to court, and the court was like, that's not a reasonable accommodation because that would bankrupt them. They could not make that accommodation. Cost-wise, it just doesn't make sense. So what do reasonable accommodations look like? Here's a list. It's not necessarily comprehensive, but these are good places to start. Again, they're things like easy to reach switch handles, providing flashing alarm lights in case you can't hear, add raised markings on control buttons for people who are sight impaired, things of that nature. So what doesn't the ADA cover? The ADA does not cover homosexuality or bisexuality. It does not cover gender identity disorders. It does not cover compulsive gambling, kleptomania, or pyromania. Kleptomania is stealing stuff. So if you have an employee who's like, oh, I keep stealing everything here, but it's a disorder, they're not covered under ADA. Pyromania is setting things on fire. So again, if you have an employee who's like, just burned down our building for the third time. It's compulsion. I can't help it. They're not covered under ADA. Psychoactive substance use disorders resulting from current illegal use of drugs, or infectious or communicable diseases of public health significance. So the thing I want to back up just a little bit about substance use is that the minute you're in recovery, you are covered under ADA. If you are a recovering alcoholic, if you're a recovering meth addict, if you're a recovering, cocaine user, as long as you're recovering, you are protected. The minute you show up to work drunk, under the influence of some sort of drug, if you are a current user, then you are no longer protected under the ADA. So I talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, and how there was some exemptions, right? So if you are a organization that has fewer than 15 people, that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't apply to you. And that is the case. However, there are fair employment practices, which are state and local laws, that are oftentimes more comprehensive. So there are places that say, we don't care if you have one employee, you cannot discriminate against people based on, their protected class status. But that is up to the state or local levels. So that will differ from, area to area that you're in. Probably one of the most current things that happened that was interesting as far as discrimination and personnel selections go is the repeal of the 2010 repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So that was the original act was done in the mid-1990s during the Clinton administration. And basically what they said is you're not allowed to ask military personnel if they are gay or bisexual, but if they do disclose, then they could potentially be dishonorably discharged. So in 2010, they said this isn't a good law. We want people to actively be able to serve and actively talk about if they choose whether or not they are gay, bisexual, lesbian, transgender. So they repealed that act of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We're going to talk about sexual harassment really quick. So sexual harassment is any kind of unwelcome advances, requests for sexual favors, other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And an employer is considered guilty of sexual harassment when an employer knew or should have known. And if the employer allows non-employees, such as customers or salespeople, to sexually harass employees. So this is important to you as a manager because they have changed the laws such that if you are a manager and knew that sexual harassment was taking place, or you should have known sexual harassment was taking place, somebody can not only sue the organization, they can actually sue you personally. So we want to make sure that we treat this as an important and legitimate thing that we are aware of and handle sensitively yet judiciously in the workplace. There are two types of sexual harassment. There's quid pro quo harassment, which means this for that. This is the kind of sexual harassment where you have somebody in a position of power who requests something of a sexual nature, or something bad will happen to that person. So this is when a boss says, if you do not sleep with me, I will fire you. If you do not go on a date with me, I will demote you. If you don't kiss me, I will put you on a work schedule where you work nights. So clearly if you're not giving me what I want, I'm going to harm you in some kind of way. What's interesting here is I list the on-call versus Sundowner Offshore Services of 1998. This was a really interesting case because we used to think about sexual harassment only in terms of males sexually harassing females. And we used to think about it in terms of desire or, sexual attraction. This case was really important because it determined that sexual harassment isn't about attraction, it's about power, and that anybody can sexually harass anybody else. So basically what happened is this was an oil rig, and there was a guy who was sexually harassed by his boss or his supervisor who was also male. So it was a male sexually harassing another male. And at that point, people were like, males don't get sexually harassed, right? Or males don't sexually harass other males. This determined that, yes, that does happen. Females can sexually harass females, males can sexually harass males, females can sexually harass males. It doesn't matter. If it's happening, it's not legal and it needs to be stopped. The other type of sexual harassment is hostile environment. So this is when unwelcome sexual conduct has the effect of basically interfering with your job. This can include things like dirty jokes, vulgar slang, nude pictures, swearing, personal ridicule, and insult. So it's not that you're my boss and you're saying, I have to sleep with you. It's you're constantly making comments. You're constantly putting me in a sexualized environment. It's not necessarily saying you have to sleep with me or else your job's going to be forfeit. Courts use a reasonable person for this hostile work environment. And basically what a reasonable person test is if I described the work environment to 10 people off the street, would at least 9 people say, yeah, I couldn't work there. That would be horrible. That's not appropriate. That's not professional. I couldn't get my work done. If at least like 9 out of 10 people would say that, it's probably a hostile work environment. You know, if it's a case where, and there was a famous case where this happened, over the water cooler, a guy was discussing the latest Seinfeld episode. And I believe it's the Seinfeld episode where they were talking about masturbation. So a male coworker was talking to another male coworker about the plot line of this sitcom, Seinfeld. And a woman walked up, she overheard the conversation, and she filed sexual harassment, sort of hostile environment. And they said, well, you know, it wasn't directed towards you. It only happened once. The purpose was clearly not to make you uncomfortable. Again, this was a one-off kind of thing. If you explain the situation to probably 10 people off the street, I don't think you would get 9 people that say, no, I clearly could not get my work done because, you know, these 2 guys discussed a plot line of a sitcom for 5 minutes over a water cooler. I do have a clip for you guys to watch. It's to kind of show you the environment that's not too far removed. It is a pitch for the series Mad Men, but it does show you kind of certainly hostile work environment, you know, maybe quid pro quo, sexual harassment, and also just sort of details a time that's not so far removed that was the norm. That's how things happened. So we're still sort of fighting a battle to make sure that everybody's professional and sexual harassment does not happen in the workplace. So if we talk about sexual orientation is not covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are no federal laws that bar discrimination based on sexual orientation or transgender or transsexual individuals. There are certainly fair employment practices. Remember talking about those that will cover LGBT communities, but that is spotty. It's, you know, location by location specific. However, if we look at companies, we actually find that a lot of people are fostering sort of gay-friendly workplaces. So even though you don't have federal protection, there are organizations that say, hey, we will not judge you based on your sexual orientation. We will not base, based on your sexual preference. And we find that actually most companies in Fortune 500 companies now offer health benefits to same-sex couples. Again, you are looking for top talent. You are looking for people that do their job the best they can. Who somebody is attracted to sexually probably has very little to nothing to do with how well they do their job. So it's probably something you don't want to pay attention to, even if it's not a legal issue per se as far as federal rights go. So now we're going to get into some interesting discrimination issues. So these are kind of hot topic, emerging things. Weight discrimination is interesting. If you are overweight, you can be covered under ADA, but you oftentimes have to be overweight, so much overweight that you cannot do a majority of things in your life. So if you're talking like you're packing an extra 30 pounds, you are probably not covered under the ADA as far as weight discrimination. But we do know that people that are obese are oftentimes discriminated against. So there are questions of whether or not we are losing top talent because of sort of social prejudices that we have. But I do want to talk about this attractiveness and discrimination. So it is it's not a surprise that attractive people oftentimes get preference, right? So we know that people who are, how do we say, unfortunate looking are oftentimes discriminated against, right? Pretty people get the jobs more often, they get promotions more often. There are whole industries that are based on hiring kind of pretty people, and there's not really laws against, if I go up for a job and I don't get it, and I know it's because somebody who is super attractive got the job, there's no place that I can go and be like, oh, well, where are the laws to protect ugly people? Like there's nothing on the books to do that. And that's been a case for a long time. That should be no shock to anybody. However, what we're going to cover today is, what if you're too attractive? Can you fire somebody because they are too hot? So I'm going to I'll go ahead and just play it within the narration.
And now to the story of a dental assistant in Iowa whose boss fired her because he said she was too attractive. That's right, there were no accusations of cheating or flirting. Her only crime was looking too good. And the state's highest court has now sided with the boss. Here's ABC's Tanya Rivero.
Melissa Nelson spent 10 happy years working as a dental assistant until she was fired because her boss said she was too tempting and a threat to his marriage. On Friday, the all-male Iowa Supreme Court unanimously agreed dentist James Knight was justified when he fired an employee he saw as an irresistible attraction.
I'm devastated. I really am. There's not an appeal. The state is as far as we can go.
The decision is sparking much controversy. Some employment attorneys are calling it a dangerous throwback.
I wouldn't have been surprised if it was a decision that was written in 1970, maybe by the characters of Mad Men.
The 32-year-old married mother of two says she saw her employer as a father figure and was shocked when Dr. Knight admitted even though she was great at her job, he couldn't be trusted around her.
After working so many years side by side, I didn't have any idea that would have crossed his mind.
According to court documents, Dr. Knight referenced Nelson's infrequent sex life, saying that's like having a Lamborghini in the garage and never driving it. And when the doctor's wife discovered him sending text messages to his assistant, it was his wife who demanded she be fired. Nelson sued for gender discrimination.
I think the women in Iowa should probably start going to work in burqas for fear that their boss might find them sexually attractive and terminate them.
Dr. Knight's lawyer gave ABC News this statement. Nelson was not terminated because of her gender, but to preserve the best interests of his marriage.
I think it's sending a message that men can do whatever they want in the workforce.
Nelson's lawyer tells me they've both received a huge outpouring of support, with some even offering to pay legal costs. But after 3 long years of fighting, there can be no more appeals since Nelson alleged a violation of state law, Dan, and not federal.
And it bears repeating, all the judges, male.
Unanimous decision.
Interesting. All right, Tanya Rivera, thank you.
So, interesting legal case. I find this fascinating because if they had decided in her behalf, then you're setting precedents that there are protections that need to be in place for people who are too attractive. But how do you determine that, right? How do you determine whether or not somebody's attractive or not attractive? It opens up this kind of wild speculation, and it's certainly an interesting, not only legal question, but also sort of personnel question. I'm actually going to stop the lecture here. We're not done, but I don't want it to get too big, so we're going to do a part 2, so join me for part 2.